to this interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, I actually have this marked at a specific spot. There's one spot in particular that I do want to focus on, and that's starting with the issue with China. We're going to dive into a little bit about Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and how our government actually runs. There's just some things that are said here that I really want to touch on, because there wasn't a lot of things I heard during this interview that surprised me. A lot of the things that were said were things that I've been saying for quite some time, but there were a couple of things that I did not know about that I thought were important to address. Let's go ahead and start at this part here.
Well, of course, it did come true. And you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point. And many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that the opposite happened. But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia, do you think, convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion population, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds, or 5% a year. It used to be even more. But that's enough for China. As Bismarck once put it, potentials are the most important. China's potential is enormous. It is the biggest economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy.
Pause right here for a second. That piece right there that Putin just said is very important. This is something I've been trying to show to people over the past couple of years I had this show, which was that if you look up the top banks in the world, China has most of the top banks in the world, and most of their banks are in the top 5. That wasn't always the case. That's really what the US government is afraid of. The fact that they actually have a real competitor. That was never supposed to happen according to the West. You see, according to the United States, according to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, there was never supposed to be another power that could emerge to become a somewhat superpower competitor against the United States. That was never supposed to happen. That's why they have that fear of China.
It has already overtaken the United States quite a long time ago, and it is growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom. Let's not reason in such terms. And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that.
Pause right there. So they're getting into the part in reference to why he decided to invade Ukraine. That part there about NATO expansion, this is something a lot of us on the left have been talking about for quite some time. The moment this war actually started, we said that it was provoked by NATO, that they expanded further. They were not supposed to after the agreement, after the Berlin Wall fell. So what Vladimir Putin here is saying is that the United States government lied to him. They did it anyway. But notice what he always also said at the end of that. We tolerated that. The 5 expansions, we tolerated all of that. But I guess it gets to the point eventually where you're like, how far is this supposed to go?
We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there's no communist party power. Let's negotiate. Moreover, I have also said this publicly before. There was a moment when a certain rift started growing between us. Before that, Yeltsin came to the United States. Remember, he spoke in Congress and said the good words. God bless America. Everything he said were signals. Let us in. Remember the developments in Yugoslavia before the Yeltsin was lavished with praise? As soon as the developments in Yugoslavia started, he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but raise our voices for Serbs in their defense. I understand that there were complex processes underway there, I do, but Russia could not help raising its voice in support of Serbs, because Serbs are also a special and close to us nation, with Orthodox culture and so on. It's a nation that has suffered so much for generations. Well, regardless, what is important is that Yeltsin expressed his support. What did the United States do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. It was the United States that let the genie out of the bottle.
Yep.
Moreover, when Russia protested and expressed its resentment, what was said? The UN Charter and international law have become obsolete. Now everyone invokes international law, but at that time they started saying that everything was outdated. Everything had to be changed. Indeed, some things need to be changed, as the balance of power has changed. It's true, but not in this manner. Yeltsin was immediately dragged through the mud, accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing, of knowing nothing. He understood everything, I assure you. Well, I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, the Yugoslav issue is over, but we should try to restore relations.
Pause. What was really interesting about this interview is that I feel like at least those of us in America, we have been heavily propagandized by our government and the media to believe that Russia is this big, bad, cold place and an enemy of the West, not just from our politicians, but also in the media and also through Hollywood. Because when I was a kid, I remember seeing movies, and you still see this today, where Russia was always the enemy. It was this cold place, and Rocky IV, that's a good example. Stranger Things. So what's interesting is notice he said we were trying to restore relations. And that's something you'll hear common throughout this interview is the number of times he said we tried to have a peaceful way. We tried to negotiate. We tried to do this. We tried to work things out in a peaceful way or negotiate. But it was the United States government and NATO that really provoked all of this in the first place. They were the ones who were starting the coup. They were the ones that started the violence. They were the ones who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And yet you have to be careful because the thing is, the media is controlled by the United States. Western media is controlled by the United States. It doesn't matter if you live in Europe or you live in the US. If you watch Sky News, that's still controlled by the US. If you're watching the BBC, that's still controlled by the US. So all across the world, people are getting the wrong information and not getting both sides of the story. So you don't have to like Tucker Carlson. I'm not a fan of Tucker Carlson, but if mainstream media journalists and commentators would have done this interview, he wouldn't have had to do this interview. This wouldn't even be an issue. The number of times you can interview Zelensky, but you were never willing to let the American people hear the other side of the story. And as a journalist, you know there are always two sides to the story.
Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through. And moreover, I said it publicly, I can reiterate. At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him, Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen? Suddenly he said, you know, it's interesting. I think so.
See, this was one of the statements that he made in the interview that I was not aware of. I never knew that Russia actually wanted to join NATO. You see, these are the kind of things you probably wouldn't hear if this interview didn't even happen. Now, for the US government, for all the years they've told us that Russia is this evil, bad boogeyman or whatever, an enemy of the West. If that were the case, why would they have asked to join NATO? If they despised us so much.
But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, you know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now. You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview. He'll confirm it. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened. Okay.
Were you
It's
sincere?
impossible now.
Would you have joined NATO?
Look, I asked the question, is it possible or not? And the answer I got was no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out what the leadership position was,
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
if he had said yes, the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and eventually it might have happened if we
See this, guys? These are the kind of things you don't hear
had
about.
seen some sincere wish on the other side of our partners. But it didn't happen. Well, no means no. Okay, fine.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive, I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
You said I was bitter about the answer. No, it's not bitterness. It's just a statement of fact. We're not bride and groom, bitterness, resentment. It's not about those kind of matters in such circumstances. We just realized we weren't welcome there, that's all. Okay, fine. But let's build relations in another manner. Let's work.
So here's another thing, guys. Okay, the NATO thing didn't work out. Notice how he said Bill Clinton said one thing in private, but then after he talked to his team, he changed his mind. Again, it points to the fact that the president is just a puppet. I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like in just a second. But the presidents, they're just puppets. They're not really in control of anything. They have puppet masters that they respond to. And I've been saying this for years. But this is really interesting. Even after the NATO proposal did not work out, he still said, let's try to build relations in another way. Let's continue.
For common ground elsewhere. Why we received such a negative response, you should ask your leaders. I can only guess why. Too big a country with its own opinion and so on. And the United States, I've seen how issues are being resolved in NATO. I will give you another example now concerning Ukraine. The US leadership exerts pressure, and all NATO members obediently vote, even if they do not like something. Now, I'll tell you what happened in this regard with Ukraine in 2008, although it's being discussed. I'm not going to open a secret to you, say anything new. Nevertheless, after that we tried to build relations in different ways. For example, the events in the Middle East, in Iraq. We were building relations with the United States in a very soft, prudent, cautious manner. I repeatedly raised the issue that the United States should not support separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus. But they continue to do it anyway. And political support, information support, financial support, even military support came from the United States and its satellites for terrorist groups in the Caucasus. I once raised this issue with my colleague, also the President of the United States. He says, "It's impossible. Do you have proof?" I said, "Yes." I was prepared for this conversation, and I gave him that proof. He looked at it, and you know what he said? "I apologize, but that's what happened." I'll quote. He says, "Well, I'm gonna kick their ass." We waited and waited for some response. There was no reply. I said to the FSB director, "Write to the CIA, what is the result of the conversation with President?" He wrote once, twice, and then we got a reply. We have the answer in the archive. The CIA replied, "We have been working with the opposition in Russia. We believe that this is the right thing to do, and we will keep on doing it."
So you see this part here where the CIA gets involved? What have we been saying for the longest time, right? A lot of times, who's making these decisions in reference to foreign policy? A lot of times, who decide what information is released in the media? There was a clip, I can't play it on here because of copyright, but there was a clip of a guy who was former CIA, and he did this interview back in the 70s. And he was actually saying, he said, what you see in the newspapers oftentimes comes from them. They're the ones that decide which stories are going to go out and what they want you to see. And this is why it's important, and I say this all the time, support independent media, but it's important that you do your own research. This is why it's important that you don't just watch and pay attention to mainstream media, because they're only letting you see the stories they want you to see. Meanwhile, there are other things that are happening that they're completely hiding from you. Right. But once again, this was another example, even when it came to the Middle East, another example of Putin saying, OK, let's try to build relations in another way. So what you see throughout this interview is that as much as the U.S. government painted Vladimir Putin out to be this evil, brutal dictator who wants to just take over all these other countries, and he's going to go into Poland and all this stuff as well, too. He seemed very calm during this interview. You know, I mean, Joe Biden wouldn't sit down and have this conversation with Tucker Carlson. Would Joe Biden sit down and have a 2-hour conversation, you know, and answer these kinds of questions? I don't think so. I don't think most political leaders in this country would. So that's something to think about. And then on top of that, all the things that he's saying, all the information that he is giving to Tucker Carlson, I saw that this video on Twitter had over, I think it's over 100 million views now on Twitter. I have to double check again. The number keeps going up, right? Just think about how many people this reached and how many more younger people are going to start asking questions about, okay, we are totally against the decisions that's happening, you know, by the Israeli government in reference to the Palestinian people. But now we're starting to question, what is our government doing all across the world? All across the world.
Just ridiculous. Well, okay. We realized that it was out of the question.
Forces in opposition to you. So you're saying the CIA is trying to overthrow your government?
Of
course, they meant in that particular case the separatists, the terrorists who fought with us in the Caucasus. That's who they called the opposition. This is the second point. The third moment is a very important one, is the moment when the US missile defense system was created. The beginning. We persuaded for a long time not to do it in the United States. Moreover, after was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean, I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team. I proposed that the United States, Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that, we believe, if created unilaterally, threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was being created against missile threats from Iran. That was the justification for the deployment of the missile defense system. I suggested working together, Russia, the United States, and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I said, "Absolutely."
So once again, look who's wanting to work together. Look who was trying to build some type of relationship. And this is not to say that Vladimir Putin is innocent. No political leader is innocent. No political leader is perfect. But what it does show you is there's a lot that has not been told to, particularly the American people, about the inner workings behind the scenes that we did not see. So to make it seem like, and Chuck Schumer did this recently, to make it seem like Vladimir Putin is against everybody, and never wanted to cooperate or build any type of relationship, you can honestly see that's not true. That wasn't the case. And it seems like it was the United States that didn't want to accept relationship with them.
Ask, what year was this?
I don't remember. It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of Bush Sr. It is even easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about.
Мне сказали, это очень интересно.
I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together. The world will change. We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, are you serious? I said, of course. We need to think about it, I'm told.
Вот в этот кабинет.
I said, go ahead, please. Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came in here, in this cabinet, right here at this table. They sat on this table. Me, the foreign minister, the Russian defense minister on that side.
Министр обороны.
They said to me,
Они мне
yes, we have thought about it. We agree. I said, thank God, great,
Но
but with some exceptions.
So twice you've described US presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected in your telling.
Right. We're going to come right back to this video because I want to show you what that really looks like. We have the feudalism chart. We'll come right back to the interview. I've shown this on this channel multiple times, but it's been a while since I've shown it. You need to see what's really happening here, folks. Feudalism then and now. You have medieval feudalism and you have corporate feudalism. Back in the day, under medieval feudalism, you had the monarchs, landed gentry, clergy, royal ministers, merchants, vassals, and everyone else, which were peasants, laborers, and conscripts, right? Today, you have corporate feudalism. At the very top, you have central bankers. That's the Federal Reserve, Bank of Japan, ECB, etc. Next, you have the big bankers. That's your JP Morgans. That's your Goldman Sachs. Next, you have the corporate elite. Those are the Fortune 500 companies, and those are the multinationals. And it is not until you get to the fourth spot that you have elected officials. That is your president, that is the MPs, and that are the representatives. After elected officials, top bureaucrats, which are commissioners, secretary, judges, top professionals, which are doctors, entertainers, and clergy. And at the bottom, everyone else, workers, students, and soldiers. Now let's hop back up here to where it says elected officials. If the elected officials are 1, 2, 3, 4, they're number 4 on this chart of corporate feudalism. Do you really think they're the ones running the country? This is really interesting for people to see. I always keep this. Eric keeps this picture for me because we always go back to it every now and then. It's important. At the very top are the central bankers, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, etc. And I would argue, even when we're talking about these elected officials, I would argue that the CIA, these alphabet letter agencies, are more powerful than the president. So this is important for people to understand. The person that you elect to enter the White House is a puppet. They are a puppet of the billionaire class, of the bankers, of the military industrial complex. They are puppets that serve puppet masters. Not even at the top, not even second place. Let's go back to the interview.
именно так.
That's right. That's right. In the end, they just told us to get lost. I'm not going to tell you the details because I think it's incorrect. After all, it was confidential conversation. But our proposal was declined. That's a fact. It was right then when I said, look, but then we will be forced to take countermeasures. We will create such strike systems that will certainly overcome missile defense systems. The answer was, we are not doing this against you, and you do what you want, assuming that it is not against us, not against the United States. I said, okay. Very well. That's the way it went. And we created hypersonic systems with intercontinental range, and we continue to develop them. We are now ahead of everyone, the United States and the other countries, in terms of the development of hypersonic strike systems, and we are improving them every day. But it wasn't us. We proposed to go the other way, and we were pushed back. Now, about NATO's expansion to the east.
So you hear that. Once again, he's saying it wasn't us. We were willing to do this. We were willing to go the other way, but we were pushed back. Now we get into the expansion.
Well, we were promised no NATO to the east, not an inch to the east, as we were told. And then what? They said, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we'll expand. So there were 5 waves of expansion, the Baltic states, the whole of Eastern Europe, and so on. And now I come to the main thing. They have come to the Ukraine, ultimately. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they declared that the doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO were open. Now about how decisions are made there. Germany, France seem to be against it, as well as some other European countries. But then, as it turned out later, President Bush, and he's such a tough guy, a tough politician, as I was told later, he exerted pressure on us and we had to agree. It's ridiculous, it's like kindergarten. Where are the guarantees? What kindergarten is this? What kind of people are these? Who are they? You see, they were pressed, they agreed. And then they say, Ukraine won't be in the NATO, you know? I say, I don't know. I know you agreed in 2008. Why won't you agree in the future? Well, they pressed us then. I say, why won't they press you tomorrow? And you'll agree again. Well, it's nonsensical. Who's there to talk to? I just don't understand. We're ready to talk. But with whom? Where are the guarantees? None. So they started to develop the territory of Ukraine.
Pause. Does everybody see what's happening here? It looks like the United States government doesn't know how to keep their word. So as you'll see, that's why he said, what are the guarantees? How do we know? Like, Ukraine wasn't supposed to be a part of NATO, but here we are. This is the piece that everyone should have heard the moment this war actually started. Instead, the narrative that we were told by mainstream media was that Russia invaded Ukraine. Same thing with Israel and Gaza. Same thing. October 7th, Hamas, they broke free and they killed all these people at the festival. It all started on October 7th. Miss all the information prior to those dates.
Whatever is there, I have told you the background, how this territory developed, what kind of relations there were with Russia. Every second or third person there has always had some ties with Russia. And during the elections in already independent, sovereign Ukraine, which gained its independence as a result of the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, it says that Ukraine is a neutral state, and in 2008, suddenly the doors or gates to NATO were open to it. Oh, come on. This is not how we agreed. Now, all the presidents that have come to power in Ukraine, they relied on electorate with a good attitude to Russia in one way or the other. This is the southeast of Ukraine. This is a large number of people.
So you see, once again, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. didn't keep their word. And honestly, you don't have to just look to foreign policy in reference to this. You can see this with us. They don't keep their word with us. They don't keep their word with the American people. I'm going to give you $2,000 checks if you put Warnock and Ossoff into office. And they shortchange the people.
And it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate, which had a positive attitude towards Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power, and how? The first time he won after President Kuchma, they organized a third round, which is not provided for in the constitution of Ukraine. This is a coup d'etat. Just imagine, someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome.
In 2014?
Нет.
Before that.
Нет, нет.
No, this was before that, after President Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych won the elections. However, his opponents did not recognize that victory. The US supported the opposition, and the third round was scheduled.
США поддержали.
What is this? This is a
Назначили
coup.
третий тур.
The US supported it, and the winner of the third round came to power.
Государственный переворот.
Imagine
So again, this is why you can't start with it started the date that Russia invaded Ukraine, because you miss this important piece, which is the United States started a coup. It wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the first time. The US has started coups in Venezuela and all across the world, but they'll start with a later date and not mention what they did to push this, what they did to prompt this. As we always said before in the very beginning, what has Gray Zone told you when they explain this to you? This is a proxy war with NATO. NATO is pushing this. And honestly, I know he said that he wanted to join NATO, or he asked to join NATO. Honestly, NATO needs to go. Ban NATO. NATO is a mess. If we didn't have NATO, would we have some of these issues right now? Think about it. People say, no, you have to have it because countries have to have some type of allegiance or some type of alliance with each other. No, they don't. You don't need to have this organization for that to happen. Let's go on a little bit more here.
if in the US something was not to someone's liking, and the third round of election, which the US Constitution does not provide for, was organized.
Организовали третий.
Nonetheless, it was done in Ukraine.
Не предусмотрено.
Okay, Viktor Yushchenko, who was considered a pro-Western politician, came to power.
Виктор Ющенко, который считался прозападным.
Fine, we have built relations with him as well. He came to Moscow with visits. We visited Kiev. I visited too.
Встречались неформально.
We met in an informal setting. If he's pro-Western, so be it. It's fine. Let people do their job.
Пускай
The
ситуация.
situation should have developed inside independent Ukraine itself. As a result of Kuchma's leadership, things got worse and Viktor Yanukovych came to power after all.
Ситуация ухудшилась.
Maybe he wasn't the best president and politician, I don't know. I don't want to give assessments. However, the issue of the association with the EU came up.
Но встал вопрос об ассоциации с Евросоюзом.
We have always been lenient to this, suit yourself. But when we read through the Treaty of Association, it turned out to be a problem for us, since we had a free trade zone and open customs borders with Ukraine, which under this association had to open its borders for Europe, which would have led to flooding of our
Свои
market.
границы перед Европой. И потоком все на наш рынок.
We said, no, this is not going to work.
Тогда свои границы с Украиной.
We shall close our borders with Ukraine then. The customs borders, that is.
Начал считать.
Yanukovych started to calculate how much Ukraine was going to gain, how much to lose, and said to his European partners, I need more time to think before signing. The moment he said that, the opposition began to take destructive steps which were supported by the West. It all came down to Maidan and a coup in Ukraine.
So he did more trade with Russia than with the EU. Ukraine did.
Ну, конечно. Ну, конечно, конечно.
Of course. It's not even the matter of trade volume, although for the most part it is. It is the matter of cooperation ties, which the entire Ukrainian economy was based on. The cooperation ties between the enterprises were very close since the times of the Soviet Union. One enterprise there used to produce components to be assembled both in Russia and Ukraine and vice versa. They used to be very close ties.
Нам из Соединенных Штатов
A coup d'etat was committed, although I shall not delve into details now, as I find doing it inappropriate, the US told us.
позицию.
Another freaking coup. So let's fast forward just, that was not a best part to pause that, I guess. Let's fast forward a little bit. This part right here where we get into Crimea. Am I at the right? Yeah.
They launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with the use of aircraft and artillery against civilians. This is when it all started. There is a video of aircraft attacking Donetsk from above. They launched a large-scale military operation, then another one. When they failed, they started to prepare the next one. All this against the background of military development of this territory and opening of NATO's doors.
There you go.
How could we not express concern over what was happening? From our side, this would have been a culpable negligence. That's what it would have been. It's just that the US political leadership pushed us to the line we could not cross, because doing so could have ruined Russia itself.
Once again, US leadership in the mix. And you'll see this time and time again with other countries and other conflicts. Somewhere, if we were there, chances are we started it. Chances are we started it if we were there. Now we're going to fast forward just a little bit here because I want to make sure. Oh, this part about the sea. Yeah, 5006. Let's go back just right about there. Okay, this part.
Which he had no chance of winning, frankly speaking. Everyone knew that. Then why the coup? Why the victims? Why threatening Crimea? Why launching an operation in Donbass? This I do not understand. That is exactly what the miscalculation is. CIA did its job to complete the coup. I think one of the deputy secretaries of state said that it cost a large sum of money, almost 5 billion. But the political mistake was colossal. Why would they have to do that? All this could have been done legally, without victims, without military action, without losing Crimea.
So you had innocent lives that were lost because of that coup. But notice the US government doesn't tell you about that.
We would have never considered to even lift a finger if it hadn't been for the bloody developments on Maidan. Because we agreed with the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our borders should be along the borders of former Union's republics. We agreed to that, but we never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us.
Okay, that part right there is really important. Did you hear what he just said? They did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with them. And this isn't new to the United States. The US has bases all over the world, trying to police all of these countries. Imagine if we had hundreds of bases surrounding the United States. Other countries, imagine if Russia, China, Germany had bases just surrounding the United States. How would you feel? So once again, this is another example of the US government doing something that was not a part of the original agreement.
For decades, we kept asking, don't do this, don't do that. And what triggered the latest events? Firstly, the current Ukrainian leadership declared that it would not implement the Minsk agreements, which had been signed, as you know, after the events of 2014 in Minsk, where the plan of peaceful settlement in Donbass was set forth.
This is another piece that the Biden administration leaves out, is about the Minsk agreements. This is another piece that's important for people to know.
But no, the current Ukrainian leadership, foreign minister, all other officials, and then president himself said that they don't like anything about the Minsk agreements. In other words, they were not going to implement it. A year or a year and a half ago, former leaders of Germany and France said openly to the whole world that they indeed signed the Minsk agreements, but they never intended to implement them.
There you go. Another example of signing agreements that they don't actually mean to implement, making promises they don't intend to keep. a lot of this could have been avoided.
They simply led us by the nose.
Was there anyone for you to talk to? Did you call a U.S. President, Secretary of State, and say, if you keep militarizing Ukraine with NATO forces, this is going to be we're going to act?
Мы постоянно об этом говорили. Мы постоянно об этом говорили. Мы обращались
We talked about this all the time. We addressed the United States and European countries' leadership to stop these developments immediately, to implement the Minsk agreements. Frankly speaking, I didn't know how we were going to do this, but I was ready to implement them. These agreements were complicated for Ukraine. They included lots of elements of those Donbas territories' independence. That's true. However, I was absolutely confident, and I'm saying this to you now. I honestly believe that if we managed to convince the residents of Donbas, and we had to work hard to convince them to return to the Ukrainian statehood, then gradually the wounds would start to heal. When this part of territory reintegrated itself into common social environment, when the pensions and social benefits were paid again, all the pieces would gradually fall into place. No, nobody wanted that. Everybody wanted to resolve the issue by military force only.
There you go. And you'll hear this. This is a common tale from other countries as well when the U.S. government is involved. They don't want peace. They don't want negotiation. The U.S. and the U.K. prevented them moving forward with negotiation in the very beginning. In the very beginning, we found this out when they finally admit this. It took independent journalists from the gray zone going to investigate what happened to the Nord Stream pipeline in person. It took them going to investigate what happened in person for everybody to wake up and see that Russia didn't blow up. Like, think about this, guys. Use common sense. This is what kills me, I think, so much sometimes about Americans. And I'm one of them. But still, we are heavily propagandized. The number of people I saw fall for this and said, Russia blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and they are making it so that other countries can't get gas and they're going to freeze this winter. You really think that Russia would blow up their own pipeline? Let me get this straight, folks. We're supposed to believe they blew up their own pipeline, destroyed their own bridge, all of these things. And I just felt like people weren't using common sense. That did not make any sense. It really didn't. Obviously, if anybody was there to be involved, you got to have the equipment and the resources to go all the way down there to do that, because it's all the way down at the bottom. Who else has the resources? Who else has the equipment? And who else would want to do that to make them look bad? The U.S., the United States. It's just very obvious. And I felt like after the Iraq war, after they lied to us about Iraq, I felt like every American should be like, wait a minute. We've heard this before. Why don't we find out more information? But no, they got everybody in on it. Okay. They even had the NFL players. Let's put the Ukraine flag on the cleats. I'm like, what? They had the NFL broadcasted and say, pray for Ukraine or we stand with Ukraine. Like that's what they do. It's the propaganda. They're doing the same thing for Israel.
But we could not let that happen. And the situation got to the point when the Ukrainian side announced, no, we will not do anything. They also started preparing for military action. It was they who started the war in 2014. Our goal is to stop this war. And we did not start this war in 2022. This is an attempt to stop it.
Do you think you've stopped it now? I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is the Nazification.
Okay, and this is the last piece I want to touch on here is the denazification. And I told you guys this before. I actually had a former student that was from Ukraine, and they had already explained to me about this issue coming from their country. So when they first came to the United States and they had never, been here before, they said like this was like a total different experience for them, right? So there were some cultural issues that they had to adjust to. They were not used to seeing so many different people that look different all in one space, technically here like in Boston, because this is like an international hub here, right? So what they had explained to me is they said like back in Ukraine, they're like, you just don't see different people, right? They try to say this in a nice way. In other words, what they were trying to tell me is like, you just don't see Black people like that, right? But also because of the fact that, yes, the Nazification in Ukraine is very much embedded into the culture. That doesn't mean everyone that lives there is a Nazi, but it is embedded in the culture. And I remember when this war first started and we talked about the Nazification, there were even on the left, there were some independent media commentators that said, there's only a couple of Nazis in the Azov battalion and that's it. Didn't do any research. It's embedded in the culture. And you're going to hear about that from Putin. This part's important.
This means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. This is one of the problems that we discussed during the negotiation process, which ended in Istanbul early this year. And it was not our initiative, because we were told by the Europeans, in particular, that it was necessary to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My counterparts in France and Germany said, how can you imagine them signing a treaty with a gun to their heads? The troops should be pulled back from Kiev. I said, all right. We withdrew the troops from Kiev. As soon as we pulled back our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin and got prepared for a long-standing armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe. That is how the situation has developed, and that is how it looks now.
But what is, pardon my ignorance, what is denazification? What would that mean? What is...
When he said that, I was just kind of like, come on, Tucker, now. I'm like, come on.
That is what I want to talk about right now. It is a very important issue. Denazification. After gaining independence, Ukraine began to search, as some Western analysts say, its identity. And it came up with nothing better than to build this identity upon some false heroes who collaborated with Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
I have already said that in the early 19th century, when the theorists of independence and sovereignty of Ukraine appeared, they assumed that an independent Ukraine should have very good relations with Russia. But due to the historical development, those territories were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland, where Ukrainians were persecuted and treated quite brutally, as well as were subject to cruel behavior. There were also attempts to destroy their identity. All this remained in the memory of the people. When World War II broke out, part of this extremely nationalist elite collaborated with Hitler, believing that he would bring them freedom. The German troops, even the SS troops, made Hitler's collaborators do the dirtiest work of exterminating the Polish and Jewish population. Hence this brutal massacre of the Polish and Jewish population, as well as the Russian population too. This was led by the persons who are well known, Bandera, Shukevich. It was those people who were made national heroes. That is the problem. And we are constantly told that nationalism and neo-Nazism exist in other countries as well. Yes, they are seedlings, but we uproot them, and other countries fight against them. But Ukraine is not the case. These people have been made into national heroes in Ukraine.
Yes, yes. And that's the, let me finish.
Monuments to those people have been erected.
So you see, it would be like, imagine if we had monuments of like Hitler in the United States. Like, this is really serious. So let's think about this, folks. The United States government is sitting up there and they're giving billions of dollars to Nazis in Ukraine, as I've been saying all this damn time. And people saying, no, they're not doing. No, that's exactly what they've been doing. And they're giving billions of dollars to Israel, who was trying to ethnically cleanse the land. Who are we? Who are we as a country? Who is this government? And we want to brag. We want to brag about the fact that we're a melting pot. We're funding Nazis. These are the things they didn't want you to hear, people. These are the things. Why do you guys think so many people attacked this interview before it even happened? Before it even arrived? All these different mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, Hillary Clinton, everybody came out to attack this interview before it even dropped. Because this is what they did not want you to hear. Because then it makes you sit back and take a hard, long look at this country and our government and ask, well, what the hell is our country doing, participating and aiding Nazis? This is why independent media is important. This is why it's important. And here's the thing. Vladimir Putin, I don't think he's perfect. He's done some bad things to people in his country, too. I don't think Tucker Carlson is perfect. None of these people are my heroes. I don't idolize people. But somebody needed to get the other side. And so for all the people that are coming at Tucker Carlson saying, oh, my God, he's just trying to stay relevant. He's just doing this for clicks or views or whatever. Or who does he think he is? And you didn't ask that question to Barbara Walters. Did you? No. You didn't ask that question to Barbara Walters with all the controversial political figures that she interviewed. It was okay because she was mainstream and she got the nod to go ahead and do it. But how dare someone do real journalism when you get both sides? So imagine if we would have heard both sides in reference to the war in Vietnam, in reference to the war in Iraq. The reason we're hearing both sides in reference to Israel and Gaza is because there's journalists on the ground in Gaza, independent journalists, because we have the Al Jazeera, because we have all these other people, because we have social media. You would have never known if it wasn't for those people.
They are displayed on flags. Their names are shouted by crowds that walk with torches, as it was in Nazi Germany. These were people who exterminated Poles, Jews, and Russians. It is necessary to stop this practice and prevent the dissemination of this concept. I say that Ukrainians are part of the one Russian people. They say, no, we are a separate people. Okay, fine. If they consider themselves a separate people, they have the right to do so, but not on the basis of Nazism, the Nazi ideology.
Would you be satisfied with the territory that you have now?
Нет, закончим. Вы же задали вопрос по неонацизму и денацификации.
I will finish answering the question.
There were parts of this interview that were kind of funny because that was basically his way of saying you interrupted me.
You just asked a question about neo-Nazism and denazification. Look, the president of Ukraine visited Canada. This story is well known, but being silenced in the Western countries. The Canadian Parliament introduced a man who, as the Speaker of the Parliament said, fought against the Russians during the World War II. Well, who fought against the Russians during the World War II? Hitler and his accomplices. It turned out that this man served in the SS troops. He personally killed Russians, Poles, and Jews. The SS troops consisted of Ukrainian nationalists who did this dirty work. The president of Ukraine stood up with the entire Parliament of Canada and applauded this man.
Remember this, guys?
How can this be imagined? The president of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years. Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so, I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism, but how? How do you do that?
Вот послушайте меня. Ваш вопрос очень тонкий.
Listen to me. Your question is very subtle, and I can tell you what I think. Do not take offense.
Of course.
Он, казалось бы, тонкий. Он очень противный, этот вопрос.
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky.
Значит,
You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And
That's right. And remember the gentleman that was honored in Canada and they said he fought against the Russians. What does that actually mean? I was like, people actually stood up and applauded for that. Use your brain, people. Who fought against the Russians during that time? It was the Nazis. And it just killed me. And then they had to come back and they had to apologize. And Justin Trudeau was like, oh, we had no idea. It's called history, though. It really is called history. All you had to do was Google this guy and just look this up. It was embarrassing. So the point that he's making is that, yes, Hitler died, but the ideology still lived on. That's the point he's trying to get across. So if you still have that Nazification in Ukraine, what happened before? It can spread. That is dangerous.
the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament.
All right, guys, we are back. That was pretty much the end of that, what I wanted to share anyway. Sometimes if you let it play for too long and you don't jump in to pause it, it'll do that. That's happened to me before. So anyway, we're back in. Let me go ahead and shout out the super chats. But you guys see what happened there during that interview. You get a different perspective. So there are two sides to a story, and that's what you got to remember.